Hello, and welcome to the Let's Talk Transformation podcasts. Today's episode will be dedicated to daring to think and do differently to serve a bigger quest for peace in the world. And I'm delighted to welcome John Marks, CEO of Confluence International and founder of Search for Common Ground and author of his book that comes out this week entitled From Vision to Action, Remaking the World Through Social Entrepreneurship. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be doing this.
It's an absolute privilege to have you on the show. John, your book describes how yourself and your wife, Susan Collin Marks, used the methodology of social entrepreneurship to build the world's largest peace-building NGO. And today you've got programs on the ground in 35 countries, and your work has also been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. And I just think so, where to start? Such a beautiful and inspiring story of legacy, passion, will, discipline, humanity, and leadership. And I know your book is centered around your 11 principles of social entrepreneurship. So where better to start than start from vision, which is your first principle. If we look at your never-ending quest to create a more peaceful world, can you tell us a little bit more about your vision and your story?
Okay. Well, my vision was a world where conflict was dealt with in win-win, non-adversarial ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to change that, and then I needed to find lots of ways to apply it.
Yeah, of course.
And if I have a skill, it was being somebody who could do it, be an applied visionary.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, my great skill is not in mediating, it's in using the ideas of mediation, the techniques of mediation to resolve problems and into setting up processes to deal with such problems.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I came from. Now, I'm giving you the benefit of hindsight because I'm not sure I knew that when I started, but it just the way it turned out. And so that's probably why I've had some success over the years.
And why this quest, John? Why through social entrepreneurship? How would you define a social entrepreneur?
I think a social entrepreneur is someone who wants to make the world a better place and has a certain skill at starting projects, initiatives to make that happen, and able to take it beyond him or herself and make it into something that has a wider effect, if you will. And business entrepreneurs have the same skills in launching new enterprises, but their primary motive seems to be financial gain, profit. Whereas for a social entrepreneur, the primary goal is to make the world a better place. And obviously you have to have enough money around or bring in enough money to pay your salary. And so you don't want to starve to death for the good of humanity. That's not probably a very good way to go. But the primary goal is not profit.
No, and it's so impressive to see how that purpose and that sort of bigger quest can find resources for us and with us that we didn't know we had or that we had never tested. And you know, your company Search and its organizational mantra of understand the differences, act on commonalities spoke to me and resonated a lot. I work a lot on trying to create more collaborative, inclusive cultures and workplaces in business. Can you tell us where that mantra came from and why it's so important in the process of preventing conflict, John?
Why what? I'm sorry.
The mantra of understand the differences, act on commonalities. Why is that so important in the process of conflict prevention?
Well, I think that idea was with me from the beginning, but I never had articulated it. And I was leading a workshop in South Africa about 25 years ago. And one of the participants, it was a workshop between ANC members and members of the white security services.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the participants was a man named Andrew Masando, who had been head of Spear of the Nation, the violence-prone armed wing of the ANC.
Mm.
And we were introducing ourselves, and I went first, and I said what Search for Common Ground was trying to do. And then he articulated something better than I had ever articulated it, which was, I think what you're trying to say is it's important to understand the differences and act on the commonalities.
Mm.
And since he said it better than I ever had, and actually put it in terms that I had not heard before, we made it into the mantra of Search for Common Ground.
Mm-hmm.
And for the next 15 or 20 years, I would give Andrew Masando credit for
Brilliant.
having originated those
Mm.
words. And after a while, we just made it our own.
Mm-hmm. And so what does that look like operationally then, John, if we're understanding differences and acting on common ground?
Well, what you want to do is find ways where people can agree if
Yeah.
they're in a conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be a small thing at first, but by starting with areas where they agree, you can expand it and expand it. You can build trust in the process.
Mm.
And that's a way of dealing with conflict. If you go for the whole enchilada at the first gasp, it just isn't going to work, or almost
Mm.
never will work. Maybe it will
Mm.
sometimes.
Mm.
But I find as you take what can be done, what's achievable, what's possible, and you move out from there and you expand from there. And by understanding differences, you're able to know where both the other person and and people on both sides or on many sides of the conflict are. And then you're more able to find areas where they can agree. And I
Mm.
found some humdingers over the years.
Mm. Mm. And then, so you're basically, often it's the way we can approach inclusion is we are all the same on certain subjects. There are common human needs. There are common things that will always link us, even if we are different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, everybody essentially deep down on a personal level wants the same thing. They want to, they want to be prosperous enough to be able to feed their children, to give them a good education, to live in a world where they're safe. And that's common, but you
Mm.
have to find ways to make that happen, in
Mm.
particularly when people are very close or in violent conflict.
Mm. Mm. And there are so many anecdotes in your book, but I was particularly marked by the anecdote of using sport to bring people together and taking something common where we build teams around sport, but actually acting on differences. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you did that with the wrestling?
With the wrestling.
Yeah. Or
Yeah.
another example if you prefer, but I
Well,
was particularly marked by the wrestling example. I thought it was great.
well before there was any prospect of détente between Iran and the West and the United States, we started with informal, unofficial meetings in Sweden that
Mm-hmm.
brought together high-level former officials of the two countries.
Mm-hmm.
And through good facilitation, we got them to agree on a whole way of resolving the conflicts between the two countries. But here's one of the problems with this kind of process. You can't get too much out in front of
Mm.
your official people.
Yeah.
And when our Iranians and Americans went home with this kind of paper agreement, neither could sell it to their governments back home. Neither
Mm-hmm.
side was ready. And we were very depressed by that. And we went back to Sweden. And this was after 3 or 4 meetings. And people said it didn't work. We'd like to do something else. And one of the Iranians said, well, how about getting Americans to come back to Tehran?
Mm-hmm.
That hasn't happened since the revolution happened. and any Americans who come will be very heavily criticized. But those who will be the least criticized would be wrestlers.
Mhm.
And let me say, I hadn't thought of that one. But the reason for wrestlers was the fact that wrestling in Iran is kind of the great ancient sport. The wrestlers were the samurai of
Yeah.
Iran, and it's still the most popular sport with the masses.
Yeah, I learned
And
that from your
so
book. Yeah.
I went back to the United States and found a way to reach the United States' National Wrestling Federation. And within about 6 weeks, I was on an airplane with the American wrestling team going to Iran. And
Wow.
it was complicated putting it together,
Of
but
course.
it turned out to be something that attracted a huge amount of attention. It was called wrestling diplomacy. That was the name that we
Brilliant.
gave it, but the press picked up on it very quickly. And every newspaper, TV station in the world almost uh, was covering it. And it made a big difference. And when we came back to the United States after it had happened, President Clinton invited us to come to the Oval Office of me and the American wrestling team. And he wanted to send a signal to the Iranians to say that he was looking for better relations. And he used us to send that signal. And I guess in the track two unofficial business that I was in, having the president of the United States use you to send a signal is something that you really want to have happen. In
Yeah.
any case, it happened, and it was a very positive thing for me, for the organization, for the American National Wrestling Federation. And we all had different motivations on why we did it. My purpose was to try to improve relations between the two countries. The American Wrestling Foundation, called USA Wrestling, was just interested in making wrestling into a more popular sport. And when you're in a conflict, it's clear that everybody has their own motivations, and you have to find a way to work with all of them.
It's so impressive, and it must have felt so daunting, then exhilarating, then sort of impactful. And all those emotions that you go through when you disrupt ways of doing things. You also describe how your job went from being defined by what you were against, John, to what you were working for. So, for example, creating new systems and new ways of working. And that's why that example is so powerful for me. The reframing is extremely powerful, but I also think, to bring it back to today, it's a necessary skill for leadership today. What new skills and perspectives and energy did that paradigm shift provide you with? The fact that you were now working for something, not against something.
Well, I had a career as an activist against the Vietnam War, against the abuses of the American intelligence system. I wrote a couple of books about the CIA, which, let's just say, the CIA wasn't particularly happy about. And I came to the point in my own life where I saw that the work I was doing was being defined mostly by what I was against. And I wanted to stop that. I wanted to be for things, not against it. I didn't want to keep throwing monkey wrenches into the old system. What I wanted to do was to build a new system. And it was out of that transition that I founded Search for Common Ground. Now, I'm talking to you rather glibly about that, and that little shift in my part, that big shift,
I was going to
took
say.
me about 3 or 4 years to figure out. But when it came through, I knew that I was onto something that was going to change the course of my life, and it changed the course of my work at the same time.
And how did it change your leadership, John? How did it change the way you showed up in situations?
Well, I think by getting into win-win ways of doing things, people were much more likely to to work with me. And I think to be a leader, you need to have people working with you, and
Yeah.
you need to be able to convince them. You need to be able to make propositions to people to which they say yes, what Fisher and Urey call yesable propositions.
Yeah, I
And
love that bit.
so I could do that.
Yeah.
Now, I never really developed good mediation skills. I'm not much of a mediator. I mean, I can do a little bit of it, but I chose usually to get somebody else, a specialist, to sit in front of the room or do the mediating part. My skill was with putting together the process. I became an impresario of process.
And so it's quite interesting, though, isn't it? The need to have that process or that framing if you want to step out and disrupt and do something different.
Yeah. Well, I think that most people who are mediators don't have so much skill in process, but then in developing process. What they want to be often usually is brought in to deal with a conflict, but getting the people into the room part of it is
Yes.
not something that's heavily in their skill set, often is in their skill set. And obviously there are exceptions to this. But I think if, for example, on the Myers-Briggs test, there
Yes.
are different boxes,
Yeah.
different ways of being. And my skill was not in the leading and mediation. It was being a person who put together process in which mediation could take place.
Which is, like you say, a different skill, a different profile, but also a different way of where you get your energy from. But
Exactly.
I like this discussion because difference and differences are often used as negative levers, and this is a great example of using difference as a positive leader, so acting positively on difference. And it brings me to a question I had as I was reading your book. There is so much in there in terms of what worked for you, what didn't work for you, and reflection on the process, but also the emotional infrastructure that you need to do this type of work. What is your biggest learning, John, about collaborative problem solving across boundaries, literally, if I look at what happened with the wrestling, but across cultural boundaries, across geographical boundaries, across generational boundaries? What's your biggest learning there?
Well, I think the more people involved in a conflict, the more difficult it is. So the easiest ones to solve are two people arguing over what's happening over the back fence. And the most difficult ones are the international ones where you have millions of people on both sides. And though some of the principles obtained in doing both, the scale of how you reach millions of people is much different than the scale of how you reach a smaller group or two people. And I think most people in the mediation field work with a few individuals or small groups. And we need to find ways to work with much larger groups. And diplomacy should do that, but diplomacy, as is currently practiced, it often does not.
And it's interesting because if I look at today's more interconnected world digitally, do you think that mediation can be done digitally? And if so, is that a way of scaling?
Well, I think the principles of mediation are fixed, and you need to listen, you need to find ways to bridge differences and the like. Win-win means not both people get their maximum, both people don't get everything they want, but they get the maximum that they can get, while the other one gets the maximum that they can get. But when there are a million people involved, or several million, that becomes rather complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you describe in your book how you scaled your impact through media and radio and television. I'm particularly interested in what you did with team events, the show that you put together. Could you walk our listeners through how that idea came about and how you scaled it? I found it fascinating.
Well, from the beginning, we started out doing workshops and trainings.
Mm,
And I noticed that there'd be 25 or 30 people in a room, which was fine. And you could sometimes really do miraculous kinds of things. But there were only 25 or 30 people, and I wanted to change the world.
yeah.
And so I set up something called Common Ground Productions, which in the beginning had absolutely no reality. It was just, in fact, what gave it reality is I had cards printed, which said I was president of Common Ground Productions. And the people who print cards don't ask for credentials or diplomas or whatever. All they want is, $50 or £50 to pay
Yeah.
for the card. And so I set it up and it took on a reality of its own. And by the time we were finished, we were producing in about more than 20 countries television, what I called soap opera for social change. And our most prominent example of that was called The Team.
Mm-hmm.
And that arose out of an intern of ours in the year that Germany had the World Cup, about
Brilliant
6 months
stuff.
before it started, the World Soccer
Mm,
Cup. About 6 months before it started, he came into my office and said, "What are we doing to take advantage of the World Cup? It's the most watched event in the world." And I said, "Well, I don't think we're doing anything, but you're certainly right. That's a very good idea." And by the time he left, we decided we could do a soap opera, a dramatic series about a football team that had on it the members of diversity of a society,
mm,
and which most football teams, soccer teams have on them anyway.
yeah. Yeah.
And then you could have all sorts of adventures and problems and residence permits and visas and passports, and you could do anything with it once you had the team in place. And we started with in radio in the Ivory Coast and Angola, and then we expanded it to television because Her Majesty's government was very big on this idea
Mm,
that soap opera could change behavior. Uh, the UK has something called the Archers,
yes.
which it was the first of these kinds of dramatic series,
Mm,
which goes back into the late 1940s, early 1950s. About the whole idea was the government was trying to encourage farmers
mm,
to adapt more efficient kinds of methods. And it was a soap opera for social change, the first one, as far as I know.
mm.
And 70 years later, it still
It's still
exists as a
going.
daily soap opera on
Mm,
BBC Four.
mm,
And I saw that as a possible way of taking the kinds of ideas that I wanted to spread around the world and using them. And the team, by the time we were finished, we'd produced it, I believe, in 18 countries, and altogether there were more than 350 episodes.
wow.
Uh, and it took off like Topsy, if you will, and it was very successful. And it became the signature um, program for the kind of work that I was doing.
Mm. Based on common ground again, based on
Yeah,
sport
no,
and what
it was
people
pure
like. And,
common ground.
yeah.
It was the same process as having a mediation where
Yeah.
you have two people in a room getting over their differences, except we were doing whole societies at a time, and our audience was in the millions.
Mm,
And it was a culmination of how you can start to take these things to scale. And there's an awful lot of evidence that dramatic television can change attitudes and behaviors.
Yeah.
In the United States, the attitudes towards gay marriage really changed rapidly because of some TV series that made it work.
Yeah.
It's a process of, and the repetition is very important.
Mm.
Having 13 episodes or 26 episodes as opposed to one episode, people get into it and the
Yeah.
characters become familiar, and they come every week, they come into your living room, into your saloon, and after a while you start paying attention to them,
Yeah.
and they become almost members of the family sometimes.
Yeah.
And that we were taking advantage of that.
Mm.
And I think it was very effective. And unfortunately, there's not enough of this kind of work in the world.
Mm. And those characters, you can identify with them culturally, but also on a personal level in terms of everyday life, which is so impactful. But it isn't soap opera. It's not something I would have thought of or even done a word association with international diplomacy and conflict resolution. So it's constantly coming up against our own biases or our own mental models around what goes with what and what will work and what won't work. Which brings me to one of your principles from Napoleon around on s'engage et on voit. So we'll try it and we'll see. And a great way of finding new opportunities and possibilities that you would never have thought of if you hadn't have just trusted the process and let things unfold. And team is one of those, isn't it? That on s'engage and then we'll see. I would be really interested, John, in your thoughts on how that can help leaders of teams and communities in more rigid corporate structures. How can you see that principle helping them?
I'm sorry, I'm having some trouble hearing you. Say, please repeat that, please.
How could you see the third principle of on s'engage et on voit? So how can it help leaders in organizations, in business corporations?
Mm-hmm. Well, I found out early on that many of the best ideas on how to proceed came out of what happened before.
Okay.
And I found a maxim or a quotation from Napoleon, who doesn't get quoted very much in
No.
sort of peace-loving circles. He said, "On s'engage puis on voit," which means one becomes engaged and then one sees what the possibilities are. So that was my primary way of expanding the organization. Something would happen, a telephone call, a person, and it wasn't our program. We would start something new because of a possibility that came up out of something we had already done. That, in the language of business schools, is called adaptive management,
Yes.
as opposed to management by rules. And I think at least for social entrepreneurs, that is probably an important way to go. I'm not saying it's the only way to go, but I always resisted planning processes because you could not get that far ahead.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not unuseful to have a group sit around and talk about what they're going to do.
Yeah.
But to think that that is going to be ironbound, that is going to really determine what you're going to do, is probably not going to work. At workshops, what I would like to do is have lunch with the facilitators, talk about what happened in the morning, and see where we're going from here, rather than have a preset afternoon out of a preset planning. You need to be able to adapt, and that on s'engage puis on voit, that being able to engage and then see what new possibilities are, is very much part of it. And unfortunately, organizations seem to lose that as they move away from the entrepreneurial stage. They get much more into fixed procedures and processes. And obviously you have to find a balance
Mm.
between the fixed processes and procedures and being adaptive. But I
Mm.
always came down on the adaptive side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think organizations struggle with that. But it brings me to another of your principles, John, which is when you say it's 80% of the work is about showing up. And that you need to keep some operational hands-on function as a leader to keep you credible and to keep you grounded. Can you tell us a bit more about that and how it has served you in your career and your legacy?
Well, I created Search for Common Ground, so I could keep showing up, but I didn't have to be the one that always was showing up.
Yeah. Yeah.
In other words, I think one needed to be persistent as an organization and an individual, but not necessarily the same person.
Mm.
You could not do a long-term project if you didn't deeply engage in that project.
Mm.
And sometimes people parachute in and then get out very quickly, and they act surprised that it isn't working very well. And that isn't the way to be successful in building new enterprises. You need to keep engaged, keep showing up.
Mm.
And so that became a maxim. But what I was able to do was have an organization where after we get the initial energy, we would put people on the ground. In the conflict resolution world, we were the first to have offices around the world. And
Mm.
the reason to do that was that they needed to keep showing up and they needed to be around. And it usually took a year, 2 years before people were even credible enough to do their work well.
Yes.
And that was a part of what we were doing too. And that idea of having field offices, which clearly took more overhead and more
Mm.
expenses, was a reason we expanded it so far. We wound up with 600 people by the
Wow.
time I stepped down.
For me, it's also a great example of how you can scale a trust base um, in the field, on the ground. I mean, there are some remarkable examples of trust and the power of active listening and facilitation and mediation in the book, and the impact it can have on how you build relationships and how you manage conversations. And I mean, I would like to see that as a part of every leadership program. But it's also part of adaptive management for me, is being able to use those skills or to see where they need to be used and to draft somebody in to do it for you. If we imagine that, do you think we could create environments in business corporations where people can actually thrive, as opposed to survive, John, and get to a win-win discussion to innovate, take decisions, and to move things along?
No, I agree with what you've just said. And I think it can be created in business. Now, it may be easier to do in social enterprises,
Mhm.
which where profit is not the primary end. Because if you're totally profit driven, you may have a different attitude toward these things. But I think that the kinds of things I'm talking about also would work in business. But I never did that, so I can't prove that. It's just a supposition on my part.
Because I think conflict resolution in business is often implicit because conflicts are dampened until they get to a stage when they can no longer be dampened. So it was very interesting for me to discover your track 2 process. So the unofficial parallel things going on to try and diffuse and create a different environment so that you could start having different conversations. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from that as business leaders in how we can impact both our teams, but also the culture in which we work.
No, I think that a win-win methodology is probably the way to be successful in business. But then there are a lot of companies that disprove that. The tech companies seem to be ruthless in the way they put their competitors out of business, and they're doing very well. But I wouldn't want to work for such a company.
No, I was going to say, I think they all have a high turnover. So from a human dimension, maybe it's not the nicest or the most rewarding place to work. But as you say, it's two different lenses. So yeah. You also describe yourself, John, as impatient. So I relate to that. I would be really interested in what your learnings are as a social entrepreneur. So what can impatience help us with, and what can it hinder?
Well, the question of patience, you need to be patient if you're doing the work I was doing.
Yeah.
You need to be willing to go on and on and on. And you can be absolutely furious about what you're seeing on the ground, a level of violence, a level of killing, that sort of thing. But on the other hand, you're not going to be able to stop it by raising your hands and shouting, stop. And I wish you could, but it takes time. It takes a while. And I kind of adopted what I called an Aikido strategy.
Yes.
Aikido being a Japanese martial art where you don't frontally attack the other. When a person attacks you, you don't frontally react. You don't react in an adversarial kind of way. You accept their energy. You blend with it, and instead of trying to knock them backwards 180 degrees, which you might do if you were a boxer, what you do is you try to divert their energy by 10 degrees or 20 degrees. And that's the way to make both of you safe. And that Aikido premise was something that was at the core of all the work I did over the years.
It's, for me, your book, there are so many layers, but it's almost a guidebook for adaptive leadership in the fact that all the principles, one needs a certain amount of distance from oneself to stop the defensive, reactive tendencies we have, but also a big dose of intentionality. So the Aikido strategy was great. It made me think a lot about how I approach different situations and things that I haven't necessarily formalized before about how I interact on different situations. So I think it's one of the learnings I took away from your book is the more one can regulate one's emotions and add intentionality, the more effective you are as an adaptive leader. What are your thoughts on that, John?
Well, that's the intention of writing the book.
Super.
Or my intention.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, what you just said explains why somebody like me writes a book. And so I'm very grateful for that. Thank you very much. But one needs to internalize at a certain point almost all of that.
Yeah.
In other words, it's if you've got to think that through at every moment, it isn't going to work. But the idea of making yesable propositions, propositions to which people say yes, that after a while, that's got to be natural to you.
Yeah.
And all the ideas that I was putting there are almost common sense. I've never had any, I've been doing workshops over the years of this stuff. And I've never had anybody argue with any of the specifics.
No.
What they mainly say is, I never thought of that.
Yeah.
Or I never had a sentence or two in which we could do it. So, I mean, that's a great deal of satisfaction for me, but it's also why I wrote a book. So that kind of stuff lives after me.
I'm glad you did write your book.
Thank you.
And not only is it a blueprint, it also makes you think. about your model of that blueprint. What does that mean for me? I would also be really grateful, John, if you could walk us through an example of a yesable proposition. There are lots of examples in the book, but what does a yesable proposition look like operationally?
Okay. Well, I'll think, I'm glad to do that. And in the Congo, in the DRC, which is known as the rape capital of the world. I mean, it's a very difficult place to work. And we've been working there about 15 years at Search for Common Ground. And one of my colleagues, a person named Lena Slackmulder, was our country director for 6 years. And she really wanted to do something about rape and violence. And the military there was blamed, rightly so, for being among the being probably the prime rapists. They saw rape as almost a right, and so Lena decided that she wanted to act against this, but she saw that it wouldn't be possible by denouncing the military, which was the way most Western organizations acted. It didn't accomplish anything. In fact, it made them quite defensive and denying that they were even doing this. And she decided that she could work with the military to make this happen. And it took her a couple of years to find the right people in the military, a general particularly who was very cognizant of the bad things that the soldiers were doing and the stuff. And she worked with them in order to build programs, training programs, which essentially wound up retraining the entire army. Over 100,000 people went through this, and we'll never know how successful it was because trying to prove that something didn't happen is very hard. But I would be willing to guess that probably tens of thousands of rapes didn't take place because of this extensive retraining program. And that was, she made yesable propositions, not by denouncing, but by sort of accepting that they were who they were and working around it and finding a workaround. The metaphor, perhaps my favorite metaphor over the years, is the child's toy truck, the one where you wind up and it comes up against a piece of furniture, and it doesn't try to knock over the chair or the furniture. What it does is it backs up and finds a way around. And that's the metaphor that I love, that you keep trying to find a way around until you come up with something that really starts to work. And that's what we were able to do in the Congo and in many other places around the world.
I'm also hearing the element that you met people and systems where they were at. So accepting that this was the situation and then what could be a yesable proposition.
At any given moment, you can't change the situation.
Absolutely.
It exists. Yeah. Now you can change it in the future. You can do things, but right now you have to accept it because there's nothing you can do about it. And that's the essence of Zen, and that's the essence of a lot of things that make a big difference.
Yeah, I need to practice Zen, being as impatient as I am. Okay, well, time is running, and I do have a last question for you, and I think it may be difficult for you to give me one solitary example, but what is the most transformative thing you have ever done, John, during this impressive legacy that your book documents and teaches around?
Well, I think the most transformative thing we ever did was some of our work with Iran. I had a retired ambassador named Bill Miller, working with me on this. And Bill at the beginning of the Obama administration, he wound up taking the former U.S. Secretary of Defense, William Perry, to meet with a high-level Iranian official. And together they discussed what could happen with the nuclear agreement. And they saw it was possible. And Perry went back and talked to President Obama. And I think this was the first indication that it was possible. And what we wound up doing was showing that would be possible to have agreements between the U.S. and Iran on nuclear issues. And of course, that all got destroyed when President Trump came in. But from a point of view of having been able to succeed in something important on a massive scale, that probably is the most transformative thing that we ever did.
Wow. Okay, I'm going to leave our listeners the time to take that in terms of how impactful that is. Would you have a final call to action, John, for our listeners who are thinking, okay, what can I do to take a step in this direction?
Mm-hmm. Well, look, I think starting something and engaging and staying with it and following your vision is going to make you very happy. Now, a lot of people try that and it doesn't work out too well.
Mm-hmm.
In my case, it worked out well, but it's not obligatory. But doing something that makes your heart sings with your life is really probably the key to the whole business.
Okay, I'm going to leave our listeners with that. John, thank you so much. I feel like we've hardly scratched the surface of what's in your book, so I would invite all my listeners to read for themselves and have a think about what's in there. But thank you so much for sharing your experience, your stories, and your insight. Where can people find out more about you and your book and what you do?
Well, they could read the book. It's called From Vision to Action, Remaking the World Through Social Entrepreneurship. But I just want to say that I have I don't think I've ever had such an intelligent interview. Somebody who actually read the book.
Oh, thank you.
Beforehand, which was totally clear to me. So I want to compliment you, Susie, on doing this so well and so competently.
Thank you. And it's a great book, a great legacy and a great book. So please have a read. Great. Thank you, John. Thanks for a great conversation.
You're welcome, for sure.